Contrary to popular belief, downloads are not the only thing that you should be looking at when you're looking at your podcast analytics. And here to help us navigate this is podcast marketing expert and the host of the podcast space, Ana Xavier. I'm Jasenia, your video podcast and content creation coach, and this is Focus Influence Podcast. Anna, welcome to the Focus Influence Podcast. How are you?
Hi, Yesenia. I'm so excited to be here. It's the classic standard. I'm so excited to be here, but I am. We've been talking about doing this episode for so long. I'm poking at you. Let's go. I want to do your show. So I'm so excited. Thank you.
Yes. And we've been talking for a little over a year now, and where you helped me a lot with in your strategy sessions that we did for my podcast, and we've been talking more lately on other things. And I'm just so excited to have you here because when I think of podcast analytics, I just immediately go to Ana Xavier is the podcast analytics extraordinaire. So you're the thing.
Oh, thank you. Because to me, in my mind, the way that I want people look at analytics, you know how you look at data and people go, wom, wom, and they're that's the worst. I'm like, no, data is exciting. Data can really help make our decision making actually almost bulletproof, or just help us make decisions that sometimes feel really overwhelming because you're looking around and as a podcaster, what do you do? What do you look at? What is something that makes sense to look at, and what stuff that you probably could ignore? So at the end of these episode, I want everyone to be okay, share with us what you thought analytics could look like. And at the end of these interview, what did we share that you were blown away? So that's what I'm hoping at the end of this episode to achieve.
I love it. All right, let's get to it. So we know that whenever anybody's starting a podcast, the first thing that comes to mind is ooh, I want lots of downloads. We know that that's not the only thing. So, if that's not the only thing, can you talk about what are some of the things that we need to consider when we take a glance at our podcast analytics and see all this data?
Yes. So I think the most important thing when we're looking at analytics is really, first off, I'm going to say something that people are probably not expecting. Maybe data doesn't matter at all. If all you want is just content to feed because you have analysis paralysis, you look at the screen and you're like, what the heck do I talk about? Sometimes the episodes are just the way to feed your online content. But if you want to look at them and think about what do we need to look at, I think that the easiest way to look at it is almost like themes. What are themes that people are interested in when we're looking at our episodes? Yes, downloads will kind of give us an idea of what people are enjoying. But again, one level down, what are the connecting points? Is it that your content is beginner level and people really love it? Or is it because you're talking about things that no one in your industry is talking about? Is it mindset? Is it whatever other fields people discuss? Things that your audience is looking for. So basically, also looking at the analytics is what lights you up. And sometimes that's one level down that I think, how excited were you on that episode? I know for a fact that whenever I'm talking about social media and how we can use social media and how we can use data to inform our decision making for, content strategy, those things light me up, and mindset. And so I know for a fact that those episodes are going to have higher consumption rate because people are going to look and feel more connected to the topic, because I personally, from the inception of the idea, I am more excited to talk about it. So, what people connect to is also what I, from the get-go, was excited to talk about. So for our listener, for our viewers, what is it that these episodes have in common? And go from there. That I think that is downloads are a good indicator of that, or everything else that should we talk about consumption rate, retention, or are those things that we're going to be talking about later?
Yeah, we can talk about that as we get. I love what you're saying right now, because it really starts from how you're feeling it. If you're not feeling the content, then that's going to show up, and that's gonna become this trickling effect of, well, I'm not feeling this, but I know I just need to create a podcast episode, so here it is. But it's gonna affect your downloads. It's gonna affect the connection or lack thereof that you might have with your audience. So even before looking at the numbers and being very empirical and very like analytical, how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, and one more thing is that I feel like clients sometimes, when as an expert, I look at the content and sometimes I ask the client, like, hey, I was listening, but maybe this content that you recorded was a little confusing. You went all over the place. But you, as the creator, you think, oh, everybody will like really vibe with this content. But maybe if the episode is like an hour and a half or 45 minutes and you delve into so many things that people are like, I got really overwhelmed at the end of the episode. That sometimes is the explanation why a topic didn't resonate, is that people like, maybe the title was off, something was off. So sometimes it's like also relying on your gut feeling and not just looking at the downloads as the ultimate metric for is a topic successful. And you know, like sometimes, well, sometimes, always, it's a combination of multiple factors that leads to the final outcome of how are people resonating with that content and what are they playing. Because sometimes I would tell clients, because we would work on content strategy, and they would say, okay, so for me, I want to become an authority in these three you know, kind of subtopics. But whenever it was time to talk about things, the way they promoted the podcast episode, because they were suddenly so self-aware of that content, that the downloads didn't reflect the actual interest of the audience or how good the podcast was. Because actually, when it was time to promote the episode, maybe they didn't promote it as much because all they could think about was, what are my peers going to say? Or they had analysis paralysis where they re recorded the episode multiple times. By the time it's time to promote it, they were completely burnt out. And so there's a lot that plays as well into how the audience gets to that episode, that whole journey of why didn't they listen? Why did they listen? So I want people to think about those elements as well when looking holistically at analytics.
I love that approach. So, okay. So, one is how we're feeling, and then the other one is like how obviously we're marketing the content because it's all part of the whole workflow. So, let's say we're very, we're definitely very connected to the content that we're creating, and we have a plan to market before we go into like super diving into that, but we have a plan. What happens in the middle? So, like, what are things that we can look at from the analytical point of view of like to help us get more data in terms of not just the downloads but like you mentioned the consumption rate or any possible trends that might be arising in our own content that we might not be aware of.
Yes. So there's a lot to unpack on there. So let's just make sure that I do talk about all of those. So there are a few things that I think are super, super important to consider. And that is the beginning of the episode, those first 30 to 60 seconds are key. Not only, and this is backtracking a second, is thinking about new audiences. So people who are just new to your show and your ongoing audiences. Right. So we have three types of audiences: the potential audience, which is people who could be interested in what we do, and they're like not there just yet, our new audiences who just landed in our content, and our existing podcast audience. And most people have introductions, like intros, they are like sometimes a minute and a half long. And I'm like, this is too much for new listeners. You want people to understand what the show is about, but can we make that more concise? Because for someone who listens to your show for 1 year, 2 years, imagine listen to that same intro that is like just a laundry list of your achievements. Like if that's, or you start the episode by having maybe 3 minutes of ads, that is gonna really impact the way that people interact with your content. So let's be mindful of not only what we're talking about, but the whole landscape around that episode, right? Like these moving elements and moving parts. I'm not saying you shouldn't have ads. Maybe just consider the user path. So when people get into your episodes, what do they normally experience, right? So, first things first, in order to get people excited, and this overlaps between the potential audience, new and existing, we want to create right from the get-go an exciting overview of what's about to happen. So a lot of podcasters start the episode by having their standard intro. Instead, we need to capture people's attention from the get-go and say, okay, what is this going to be talking about? What is this episode going to be featuring? Just like you said in the beginning of the episode, right? So whether that's like a snapshot of something that was said during the interview, like a teaser, or it's the host, like I always do on my own show. I always talk about what is the thing that we're talking about by a statement that stops people in their tracks, like, oh, I really want to hear about that, right? So when we're looking at the analytics, is the whole experience. So are your podcasts super, super long? Then when we're looking at the consumption rate, and for instance, on Captivate, where both of us host, you can look at the web player within Captivate and see where people dip. And could that be because maybe the audio was really loud in comparison with the rest of the episode? Was it because an ad started? Was it because you honestly the interview wasn't that exciting and suddenly you start rambling on for a while and then you pick up, right? So when looking at that, it's not looking at the me, taking it personally. Is like, what is this episode making the listener like think about or experience that potentially is not optimal or ideal. So when we're looking at that, take ourselves out of the equation and say, okay, as a listener, what could annoy me? What could create a little bit of friction? So if there's people clicking on a section that they are replaying a section specifically, for instance, if your guest talks about like the destination website, or if there's like a promo code, or if you said something really powerful and you said it almost like in passing and the listener's like, I had that situation, I was like, oh, go back, that was really powerful, I want to listen to that again. So taking the time once a month to really revisit your analytics. And so if your podcast hosting platform, doesn't have that information, going to Spotify for podcasters, going to Apple Podcast, whatever your major platform is that listeners are consuming your content. So more than 50% of your audience is, let's say, on Apple Podcasts. Go there and figure out like, what are people really dipping in? And sometimes you don't have to worry because it will tell you like why people are replaying that section. Why are people skipping that section? All of this is just useful things to look at episode overall, like performance, because you may love to do 45-minute conversations, 70-minute conversations, but if your goal is to get people to stay until the end of the episode, then we may need to adjust our episode flow. And so that's why like it's so great to have a podcast instead of having a radio show. When you have a radio show, you have your ad breaks that you definitely have to take. You have your your news. Like all of these elements have to happen at those times. With podcasting, the beauty of it is that you look and you say, okay, people are only consuming 30% of my 40-minute episode. And I did that with a client. We looked at consumption. She had really long interviews that were about like the 45-minute mark. And so when I looked at the analytics, we looked and saw that there was 50% consumption. So we're like, okay, let's adjust the interviews to be more compact, more kind of like time intentional. And so basically every question is intentional. When we're looking at the editing, we're removing a bunch of fluff. And so our consumption went from 50-ish to 75. So that's exactly like, you don't have to have like 90% or 100% consumption, but you definitely need to be aware of like the 75% is the place where you should be. So all of these things.
Love it. It definitely is very in-depth because there are lots of micro factors influencing the consumption rate, the experience of your users, of your listeners. I mean, just think about how you yourself consume content when you're just sitting down watching TV, watching a series or something, where you can skip the intro, or you listen to the intro maybe a few times because it's really cool and very engaging.
Yes.
But there's a moment where like, okay, I'm done. Skip.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Talk about like an intro that like I would always listen to and I would like always vibe. Okay, so there's these series that I have to talk about. Like, so The White Lotus is one of those where the intro, you replay that all the time because it's like you're vibing. It's like,
So good.
yes. So as a podcast host, think about like, is your intro killing the vibe or getting people excited, right? Like, how can you create that type of experience? Again, you don't have to create something crazy like that, but how can we, by reducing the intro, like for instance, I don't even have like music. I have my ad lib intro where I talk about the topic, I introduce my guest, like three things tops, and then sound effect, and off we go to the episode. Like it's very boom, boom, boom. Here we go. I'm not wasting your time. But if your podcast is something that would benefit from like some sonic experience, like think about it like that. Like, how can you incorporate fun elements? Because again, it's your show. You get to dictate what you want and ask your listeners, like, hey, if you listen to my intros, like, and give them options, right? Like right away, don't ask them like, hey, tell me about what you think about the intro, right? Like, hey, like it's too short, it's right what I wanted, I skip through it, I don't even care, right? Like ask them and they will tell you what they think. Sorry, so that was like something that I think most people forget. You have creative control of everything about your
I
podcast.
love that. No, I love that. What a really great example because, White Lotus specifically, they have, so each season is a different theme, in a different underlying theme. So the music might be the same, but the visuals are very different. So it kind of, it sets the tone for what you're going to expect in the upcoming episodes. And that's actually a really good idea or something to implement, especially for those podcasters who have limited series podcasts where maybe you're tackling a particular topic, like very very niche in that series, and maybe that introduction could kind of be tailored to that, the content that you're going to be sharing. One podcast that I love is La Brega. It's by a Puerto Rican, it's a conglomerate of Puerto Rican people in New York, and it's about like Puerto Rican history, and each season is very different. And I just love how it's so custom to like the music, the sound effects, and everything is so custom to what you're going to be listening in that season. So it's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. Like think about it as, and you don't need to create something grandiose, but really talk about the user experience. Like it's something that is memorable, you remember that, right? So whatever you're choosing to do something that creates an emotion, right? I'm not just listening to these podcasts because, right, like I may be doing other stuff, but man, sometimes I'm gardening and I'm like have to pull my gloves and just like rewind. I'm like, hang on, I need to listen to that. That was really cool. And so again, you don't need to be a sound designer, but that experience talking about use of silences and implementing silences, and how that can create engagement by just like leaning in to the thing that was just said.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you mentioned silence because we think we need to add. Sometimes subtracting is actually the way to go.
Yes.
So, oh, go for
No, that's
it.
it. Yes.
So, okay. So we're talking about podcast analytics, but you are a video podcast as well. So your podcast is available in audio and on YouTube. Have you seen any trends or any differences when you're looking at your analytics from your podcast host versus your YouTube channel? Anything that you might like share, any insights on that?
Yes. Insights would be that if you're doing nothing, then to kind of like change, just know that audio podcast platforms and YouTube audiences behave slightly differently. And so with YouTube podcasts moving forward, maybe this will change. But as it is right now, people want to get to the nitty gritty right away. I have a problem. You, the host, has a solution for it. I don't care who you are, just give me the answer. Whereas for podcast platforms, audio tend to be, people subscribe to your show because they care about the topic that you're talking about, or they have like a relationship with you, whatever that is, and so they're there for you. So something that I noticed was my content maybe 6 to 9 months ago would be really like the type of content that people were following me for or consuming was very mindset driven. And so I was like, okay, like audio only more was about like content strategy, analytics, like strategies overall and how to's. and not so much on YouTube, which normally is a reason like you go on YouTube and you go, how to do whatever. So I was like, oh, interesting. However, something that I always tell people is look at your latest like 90-day performance, like what has been really getting people's eyes and ears for the last 90 days, and then look at almost like the year, because it will change. People will be in different seasons in life, and that's something that like just like like nature in the winter slows down and like nothing grows and whatever, and spring is like whoosh, like everything is alive and awake. It will be a lot like that for a lot of people. So sometimes it's the opposite. On winter times, people are like, I want to learn as much as possible, and then in the spring and summer, like I just want to be out and about. I don't give me things that I have to think a lot about, right? So really understanding that the 90 days, so the 3-month mark plus the year, will be showing you different performances, is not even within the platform, within different platforms, is even within the seasons of the year. So, when we're looking at what performs well, like lately, I've been doing a lot of SEO. So, basically, I on the podcastspace.com have a lot of high performing pages. And so, I test a lot of content on those high performing pages. And so, I feel like I have something that is slightly different than most people, because most people go, okay, the content within the platform. But in my case, when looking at the analytics, I can totally see that it's an external factor. So, it's people coming into my website playing the content within that page. So it's not necessarily like on YouTube, but I will say that it has shifted from mindset to more like the basic stuff about podcasting. So, like, the episode about the 3 types of audiences that you have is one of the best performing. The 7 goals you could set for your podcast is a high performing one as well. So, more from the strategic, like setting up your podcast for success, that has been a really interesting growth and like just shift. And on audio platforms, it has been the same ones that I normally look, and something that I'm gonna drop a tip. Something that I always do in each single episode is to reference at least one other episode from the catalog. So, thinking from the user experience, I'm telling people, hey, you know how on YouTube you can have suggested video at the end, like, hey, watch this. You don't necessarily have that ability to do that on audio platforms. So I say to the listener, hey, I actually delved more into this. Or if you want more in-depth knowledge um, on this other thing that is kind of related, but if you are like an overachiever, you can go and listen. Like, people will listen, not to like, not every single person who listens to that episode will do that, but I definitely see on the back end when one episode is playing and the first one is playing in that same like analytical like screen, I'm like, oh yep, it's working, right? So also thinking about, did you reference another episode? Are there like themes? Looking at all of those things is also key to understand how performance is working, because people, like for instance, creating playlists on YouTube is also a different way to force behavior when you're looking at it, right? From the user perspective, like, oh, hey, if you're giving me this playlist that I am likely to have interest in, people will play. So that's something in a nutshell. What has happened on my YouTube is that I'm like testing and pushing behaviors, and I've been really successful at like driving the behaviors that I want to see. So that has happened in the latest, I would say, probably 3 months, which has been interesting.
So
Mhm.
that is so cool. I love that how I love this episode because there's just it's jam packed with a lot of insights on like insights and analytics. Okay, so lately at the time of recording this episode, Spotify recently there's some news on Spotify specifically for IAB non-certified data provided by them since 2020. What's your take on this? Can you share a little bit more on that?
So this conversation, basically, it was reported on the news that Spotify and Chartable and Megaphone, which are all owned by Spotify, and this is where it's worrying to have consolidation in the market. So if a player is doing something bad or they do something wrong or something goes down, like a bunch of other platforms go down as well. So it was reported on the news that they were basically removing their subscription from the IAB. Oh, gosh, I can never say, which is the Interactive Advertising Bureau or something. I can never say this, whatever. It's basically an organization that checks that if your downloads are legit, if your data on your podcast is legit. And so I was like, what is going on? So basically, they are compliant. They're just choosing to not renew their subscription. Oh my gosh. To make it in layman's terms, basically, you are either compliant or not compliant. And they say that since 2020, they have been not certified. So basically, they didn't like buy a subscription. They're still like supposedly compliant. And I'm like, what does this mean really? Because honestly, like, if you don't want to pay, because the membership or certification costs money. And so they're saying, oh, we want to cut down on costs. And so I was like, okay, but still, if you're removing yourself from this, it's you saying, yes, I am like compliant. And I'm like, yeah, but if nobody else is checking it, we're
Are you
relying on
really?
you. Yeah, are we relying on you to say the truth and do the right thing? So if you host your podcast on Spotify for podcasters, or if your audience is on Spotify for and like you're looking at the data in the back end on Spotify for podcasters, just know that it could be perhaps not very 100% accurate. So it could be a little embellished. Maybe it's not tracked correctly. We are not gonna know, I guess, now. So that unchartable, which I was like, oh, boo. So this is still a developing story, by the way. So just FYI, at the time of recording, this is what's been coming out, and I know we will know more. But I'm sure we will also follow up on this episode and make sure that we include the links in the show notes if anything changes. Right? Wink, wink.
Exactly, exactly. And the thing is, there's a lot of changes in the podcast industry. I mean, over the past year alone, we've seen a lot of changes in regards to YouTube and podcasting. So there's a lot of stuff happening consistently. This is just at the time of the recording. This is April 2024. This is the latest thing, and it's definitely there's a lot of questions that that could pop up, but definitely wanted to bring this, since we're talking about analytics, and we know this definitely affects, or not, we don't know,
Yeah.
how things are tracking, and maybe how it might influence other hosts or the industry in general. Like, we don't know. I mean, it's like AI and how it's changing everything. So there's a lot
100%.
of changes and things. And I think as a podcaster, it's just good to know what's happening and, make your decisions accordingly based on what you think, what your goals are, what the goals are behind your content.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, just be aware of, and if you don't want to be aware, subscribe to newsletters that give you the nitty-gritty, like the breakdown of what things, like, hey, a recap of what's happening in the industry. Because I think it's important, because if you want to consider like sponsors are, sometimes uneducated about a ton of stuff, because they're like, I want to just give you money, and they don't understand. So you understanding the numbers and the metrics will help you be a better receptor of the money, and guide like advertisers into a better position to position your podcast as the best possible thing possible uh with what you have right now. So downloads,
Exactly.
consumption, reach, whatever it is. So just know that you kind of should care about this.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I'm glad that you mentioned the sponsorships, because those are some of those initial questions that whenever somebody's trying to think of a podcast. Oh, I want lots of downloads because I want sponsors, but there's a lot that goes into that, and you being aware of your podcast performance based on your goals, which could be landing sponsorship, or which could be just simply, I want this to for SEO purposes alone. And just overall, everything will help you get uh, be more educated whenever it comes to making decisions for your content, your show, your business.
Yes, and something that we didn't mention, but we might as well just drop, since this episode is all about the insights. Podcasting. So it has been reported by the people that study this. So Tom Webster from Sounds Profitable, and another podcast agency that they track, Nielsen. I always forget which one it is. Is it Nielsen?
Nielsen is one and Edison is another.
Edison Research. Yeah, okay.
Edison.
So Tom Wester from Edison Research was sharing not long ago at Podcast Movement Evolutions that in terms of ads, podcast ads are really good for like bottom of the funnel. So basically awareness and attention. So sometimes what advertisers want is just to be aware, like for the audience to be aware of their product through you. And sometimes it's brand association. So a brand that wants to be associated with you because you're an expert in a in your industry or in your niche, people are going to believe what you have to say. Like, for instance, that's why like affiliate marketing exists and people recommend stuff, right? So sometimes when looking at your analytics, if you don't have like a ton of listeners, but you have high retention rate, or you have a really like loving and engaged community, and maybe it shows through, you know, social media engagement or email newsletter engagement. So all of those things are things that, you know, brands sometimes don't know, and we have to educate them. And honestly, if you search for podcast data and advertisers, you can actually look into that data. And whenever you go to meetings and talk to companies, just tell them like, hey, like people who listen to podcasts really trust the host, and so they're more likely to buy products and services from the brands mentioned. And sometimes it's not just like buying, it's just brand association. You are an expert and you recommending the product, suddenly that brand becomes like the trusted brand too. So think about it like that. Like you don't need thousands of downloads. Again, an example of this, one of my clients, she has a niche podcast. It's about global health. She has around 600 downloads per month, and she secured a sponsorship that was about $1,000 for the podcast. And like in the podcast, it's going to be beyond the podcast. It's going to include like some more deliverables, but again, the podcast was like the way to get in. And so you don't need to have thousands. Again, if you have the ads, they are like just built in the system. Like those are not going to give you a ton of money, but you can be proactive and look at your numbers and say, hey, my audience is really engaged, or maybe no one else in my industry is doing this. So your data doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that you have a product that you consistently deliver to an audience.
Love this. I love this. This so much, so many good tips and so many so much detail in this episode. Thank you so much, Anna. I love this. I think we can definitely keep talking. We love the numbers.
Right.
But let's go ahead and wrap up. And how can people connect with you? Do you have a freebie? Anything that you want to share with them?
Yes, I would recommend actually following the podcast space on podcast platforms, because that's the best freebie. It's a weekly show, very no nonsense, no fluff, marketing strategies, podcast content strategies, how to show up as a leader in your industry, how to show up as an online authority in a way that feels exciting and sustainable. So follow the podcast space on podcast platforms, also on YouTube. That would be the best way. And connect with me on Instagram. Like I have so much fun. I treat you like a friend. So make sure that you come and follow, and I'll give you all the goods, all the things you need to
Awesome.
know.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Anna. And I'll be including all these links in today's description notes, whether on the podcast platform or on YouTube. Anna, thank you so very much for being on the podcast. I'm so excited, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you.